Have you ever wanted a third-person shooter that takes some major design choices from the Souls series with a few mechanics from other titles sprinkled on top? Well, that's this game. Remnant from the Ashes is a Souls-like co-op third-person shooter with some randomly generated elements that might be my sleeper hit of the year. Don't worry about the Souls-like title though. The game is much less punishing than FromSoft's games while still maintaining a good level of difficulty, but it does have a healing item with charges that refills when you sit down at the checkpoints that reset the enemies and teleport you to other checkpoints. It's got doors that don't open from this side. Hey, wait a second, you're not supposed to be able to take damage from this isn't Dark Souls at all. It's got fog gates to bosses, a shitty swamp level, but most importantly, it has boss weapons! You know what it doesn't have though? A death penalty where you lose money, experience, or maximum health. Nope. The only thing you lose when you die in this game is your sanity when you wipe on trash mobs in the first dungeon on Nightmare difficulty for the 10th time, but I'll get to that later. The game starts on a post-apocalyptic Earth that's been overrun by evil tree monsters called the Root, and you need to stop them by stabbing, shooting, and rolling to victory. It's got a lot of good, along with some bad, and the best part of it is probably the... In Remnant, you'll be running through some semi-random overworld level pieces, shooting enemies, activating crystals that serve as your checkpoints, and looking for upgrade materials, loot, and dungeons. When I mean loot though, it rolls very much like Dark Souls loot. This game is not a looter shooter like Borderlands or Destiny. You will never find a handgun that's the same handgun you have with 2 extra damage on it. Instead, you will find unique weapons and then upgrade them continuously throughout the game. Speaking of shooting, it's pretty dang good. It reminds me of Resident Evil or maybe Dead Space, but I don't play too many shooters, so if that's just the standard third-person shooter thing, then whoops. The guns are pretty punchy and feel good to shoot. Enemies also react accordingly to getting blammed for the most part. You can carry 2 guns, a long gun and a handgun. Each weapon type has a pretty good variety of shooty boys, from shotguns to revolvers to sniper rifles to brap cannons. On these guns, you can place mods which charge up as you kill enemies, and they basically give you spells whenever they're activated. Group heal, hunter's mark, rocket launcher AoE, stuff like that. Boss weapons have set mods that you can't change, but most of them are pretty good. Ammo is dropped by most enemies and completely refilled at checkpoints, so there's never a long-term problem, but running out of bullet in the middle of a boss fight or long combat encounter is a very real possibility, so you try not to waste it. In addition to guns, you also have a melee weapon. I really like how they implemented the melee combat here. Instead of switching to your melee weapon, you just hit the attack button and you swing with your melee weapon. To shoot, you have to hold down the aim button and then press the attack button. It makes the transition seamless. This does mean you can't shoot from the hip, but it didn't really feel like anything was missing to me. Melee attacks can also be charged for more damage, and you can string 3 or 4 attacks of any kind in a row for a combo. Boss melee weapons have mod type effects on them, but you can't put mods on melee weapons otherwise. Weapons probably wouldn't be all that useful if you were naked, so good thing there's armor, which is pretty simple in this game. Head, chest, legs. Each piece of armor has defense, modifiers for each status in the game, and an effect that stacks if you have more of the same armor set equipped. All weapons and armor can be upgraded to plus 20, or plus 10 for boss weapons.
It's just like Dark Souls. Are my Dark Souls comparisons getting you angry yet?
There's also 2 ring slots and an amulet slot. You get these by finding them in the game. They do things. Finally, as you kill things and find tomes of knowledge, you will level up and be able to spend points in several perks called traits. At first, there are only 3 traits, but as you play the game, you will find many more. Woo! So that's basically all your mechanics as a player. Wait, no, I lied. You have a stamina bar that you use to run and roll, and if you die, it just re-rolls the enemies in the area, but you don't lose anything. Okay, there. Now that's everything. Every area in the game has a few things in common. There will be a hub-type overworld area where there are enemies and locked paths, upgrade materials, possible encounters, and entrances to dungeons. The overworld areas aren't that densely populated, but they have a few loot chests and crafting materials thrown throughout, and oh boy, you're gonna need them. You're gonna need so much iron in this game, you're gonna think you're playing goddamn Factorio. Most of the maps in this game are randomly put together from a list of tile sets, so you'll never see everything in the game in one playthrough. Some events that happen in one world might not happen in another. Most areas only have 2 dungeons, but 3 possible dungeon bosses, and every main boss can be 2 different things, so you're gonna need to either play through multiple times or join up with some friendos to see everything. Might as well talk about the co-op right now since I just mentioned it. It's fun to play with friends, especially to see what differences the areas have and what events that do or don't happen, but dang, every player you add up to 3 will make the monsters tankier, hit harder, and there will be more of them. But more on that later. You will also get a buff called teamwork when you're near your co-op partners, making you stronger as well. Any item that a player picks up besides ammo will be shared across all players, so if someone picks up a BFG, all the homies got a BFG now. The dungeons in the game are usually just fairly linear paths filled with enemies and items that end in another checkpoint and then a boss, maybe with an event thrown in there too. My usual loop was to find a dungeon, clear it, and then go back to the safe zone hub, Warehouse 13, and upgrade all my stuff. Then I'd go back out and look for another dungeon. In the dungeons and overworld sections, there's a certain sound that will play to notify you that a special enemy has spawned. The specials are basically the same as Left 4 Dead or Vermintide, where it can be a variety of different enemies, so that can be a little RNG, but it's kinda cool at the same time. The dungeon bosses are always souped up versions of a special with some extra abilities and different AI. Eventually, you'll come across a big bad world boss that you need to beat to get to the next area. These all have little unannounced subquests that can get you a different weapon than normally killing them. So not only can the world boss be 2 different bosses, but every world boss has 2 possible drops from killing them. After you beat a world boss, you usually get some story bits and then you go to a new area. That's basically the game. So what's good, Remnant? The core gameplay, like I said earlier, is good. It feels good to blam enemies, character customization with mods and perks is pretty cool, and co-op giving items found to every player is really neat. The enemy variety is pretty varied. Every area has different enemies, and the enemies that fulfill the same role in each area are slightly different. There are various status effects in this game, but there are also weapons that allow you to apply the status to enemies, and unlike Dark Souls, the statuses actually work on most of them. I like how the story is told a little more straightforward than the Souls series, but there are still plenty of journals and computer terminals that inject that juicy lore right into my veins. The main story also went a way that I didn't really expect pretty early on, and I was into it. It also looks pretty good, except for the first area. I'm not sure why they led with the least interesting, most bland area, destroyed city, everything's gray and brown, blah. In co-op, players actually have collision, so you can push your AFK teammates all the way to the bottom of the hub and they'll be confused as heck when they come back. There's also friendly fire at 25% damage, which can result in some pretty funny moments or duels if you want to. Melee doesn't do friendly fire though. You never really need to farm for upgrade materials, or at least I didn't. A good check through the overworld and completing the dungeons will get you through the game pretty well, or at least it did for me. For the most part, bosses are decent, especially the world bosses. Those tended to be the best ones in my opinion. The difficulty is pretty manageable for the most part. The longest I was ever stuck on one encounter was an optional boss that took me about an hour and a half of ramming my face into it constantly for me to finally beat. If you've already played the game, you should leave a comment below on what boss you think it was. You can re-roll your campaign anytime you like. This will reset the campaign to the beginning after the tutorial, and you'll have different events this time. Or at least you'll re-roll them, maybe you'll get the same exact events 4 times in a row, and be sad. The world also spawns an area according to your highest level weapon when you go into it. So you can get new game half plus if you want to. Overall, the core game is good, but there's definitely some... No! This game has some cons that are quite the doozy, and I could and have seen some of these turn people off to the game altogether. Sometimes when you start fights, it seems like you aggro the next room and a half of enemies. There's just a lot of enemies sometimes, and occasionally I feel like the game spawns enemies behind you for fun. I think this happens the worst in the first area for some reason, but dang, I don't want no special spawning behind me with a million enemies in goddamn front of me. The co-op scaling is a bit of an oopsie. When I was playing co-op, one-shot weapons like the hunter's pistol and the sniper rifle just weren't worth using because they didn't do enough damage to kill basic enemies even with a headshot. Pfft, one shot, more like, better not use that kind of weapon. It might have had something to do with how it scales to the world because at the time I had a high level weapon that I wasn't using, but the world is supposed to roll level when it's first entered, and the owner already entered and I joined afterward, and it's kind of confusing how it all works. The world scales to the person with the highest level gear, so if you're playing a public lobby on the first area and someone with maxed out gear shows up, you're gonna have a bad time. The devs are actually making an attempt to fix this though, and it might even be fixed when you're watching this. I put a thing in the description to say if it's fixed yet. Nightmare difficulty is in fact a nightmare. The trashiest of trash mobs can bonk your butt so fast you can't even say,
"This action does not have my consent."
And the worst part is there's not even a point to running Nightmare. You get an experience boost, that's it. 300% more enemy health and 75% more enemy damage for 30% more experience. No achievements, no exclusive items, just pain. Pain and suffering. Don't play on Nightmare. A lot of the lore in this game feels like it builds into nothing for me, and the NPCs reacting to your actions in the game basically ends at the first area, and after that there's basically nothing. Beating the final boss doesn't even give you any new kind of dialogue. That's kind of weird. It turns out a lot of the stuff that doesn't make any sense in this game is because the game is actually kind of a sequel to a 2016 Oculus Rift exclusive game called Chronos. So that answers a lot of questions I have about stuff that doesn't make any sense. There's some glitches in this game. Most of the ones I got actually worked in my favor, but I've read some things about key items not being received at all, or your just whole save file dying and I can't English. Some of these have already been fixed and probably more will get fixed, but I thought I might as well throw them out there anyway. But here we go. Here's the big one. Every boss in this game except one summons shitty ads all the time. The first boss I got in this game spawns explosive enemies that sprint at you. I died to it enough where I was questioning my purchase. I'm glad I kept going, but it really wasn't a fun time. This boss, Gorefist, is seen as one of the worst bosses in the game, and the fact that you can get him as your first boss sucks. A lot of other bosses rely on dividing your attention between a slightly big tough thing and 3 to 5 smaller things that respawn. And that's pretty lame. It's like the devs couldn't think of any other way to give you ammo mid-fight other than just throwing regular enemies at you. Honestly, after a while, you just kind of accept it as part of the boss challenge, and it isn't that bad, aside from a few encounters like Gorefist. The boss battles are more about the event itself, bosses, ads, and anything else there is, as some of the bosses have a pretty limited moveset. It's not really the same thing as a Dark Souls boss fight most of the time. That didn't impede my enjoyment of the game, but I could see how it could for other people. That about does it for my complaints, though. Even with the cons, I really enjoyed this game. Don't tell anyone about this, but I think I liked it more than Sekiro. It's a AA game with some jank, but the fun core gameplay keeps it afloat, if you can get over the bosses all summoning ads. The random generation made me keen to re-roll the game as soon as I finished my first run and see what I missed. There's supposed to be continued support for the game, and I'll probably eat up any DLC that comes out for it. The game is $40 or your regional equivalent, and you can get it on Steam, Xbone, and PS4. My initial playthrough took about 15 hours, and that's about the average, so I'll leave that up to you if you think that's a good time-money ratio. 2 Lainz, out.